Alrighty, hey guys. I just wanted to give you my notes for the lecture this week, lecture presentation, and show you some of the files that I want you to work with. They are overviewed and linked inside this presentation, so you can find them there. Also, wanted to give you a quick demo of creating character concept art using AI, which is a lot of fun. I did some earlier or some last night, and I'll show you the examples of that. That's really going to elevate our 3D art capabilities. I mean, this is a real godsend for those of us who aren't concept artists, which is the majority of the population, would say. So, really cool that we can get nice copyright-free concepts in the pipeline right away. I know that this stuff is a bit contentious at the moment, um, and it's a bit of a legal gray area. Luckily, while we're in school, we're protected from all of that anyway. We don't have to worry about copyright. Um, so I do want us to go ahead and start using these tools because since you guys are the up and coming generation, it's gonna be up to you, right? What direction things go in, whether they are banned across the board, which is, I suppose, one outcome, an unlikely one. But more likely, these things are going to be accepted and integrated into our lifestyles. I know that, like Google is already saying that they have a AI that they're adding into their Google searches, right, to improve their Google searches. So a lot of this stuff has been happening behind the scenes, and is just reaching the public's eye now, right? Which makes it seem new and fresh. But a lot of these things have been around for a little while. So we're going to use AI on the art side of things, but we still have to make our model ourselves. There's no using character generator, base meshes, anything like that is going to be illegal for this. I want you guys to make a character from scratch. Now it can be a simple character, it can be a stylized character, right? It doesn't have to be super advanced and gamey, but that is what I'm going to teach you how to do, because when I took these classes, nobody taught me, and I had to teach myself, and that takes much longer. And I want you guys to have the acceleration of having this covered in a module that it is meant for. Um, so just remember for this class, it's much the same as story design in the sense that our final output is a Unity scene that creates a cinematic for us where characters interact, some sort of story is told through the character, the environment, and through Mixamo animations. Um, I will show you guys how to make custom animations as well if you want to add those on top. But Mixamo is going to be our workhorse for a lot of the content, including rigging, skinning, and testing out our characters, which is going to accelerate us in a lot of ways. So the reason why I have this nice cyberpunk model up here is because it nicely demonstrates polygon flow, or topology as we call it in our industry. So in order to get good character models that deform correctly in animation, we have to follow some technical rules for those models so that when they are animated, they don't start bugging out. You don't get visual glitches. The textures work properly, right? And the volume of the model is maintained. So much the same way in real life, right? If I have things that bend, right? They don't suddenly like get narrower just because they're bending, right? Where we'll look at one of the files that I've made you, um, this does become a concern with lower polygon models. Now, this particular file is I think I called it arm bend demo, something like this. Oh, hey, shouldn't I? Arm rigs. So in this one, I've made a whole bunch of cylinders, as the arms and legs for our character are pretty much going to be cylinders. And these are all rigged to a set of bones. Now, to more easily see the bones, I'm going to go to the shading menu within the perspective viewport and choose X-ray joints. I could also choose wireframe on shaded, which is going to at least help us see where the bend occurs and what's going on with that geometry on the bend. Now, when we made our low poly character, we might have noticed something like this on the joints, right? Because we had not smoothed out that character at all. And so when you apply animation to a joint with very little geometry, you get this compression where the joint is suddenly moving vertices around in order to keep its weighting correct. Like each vertice is weighted to each bone, and the ones on the joints are weighted or are have a balance between this bone and this bone, right? We can actually see that information, but on this file I just disabled these for the purposes of bending them around. So I just wanted you to grab some of these and look at the differences, right? At what happens when the bone is bent, how it looks from the front, how it looks from the side, and how having certain number of cuts helps to keep that volume correct, whereas other versions of it, you get this intense compression, right? So this one is just a little 5-minute toy, right, to see um, that concept in motion. Of course, once we are making our own models and putting them into Mixamo, right, and putting animations on them, as you guys experienced last week, all of this starts to make sense in a more real terms, in like a character terms, right? Like, is the character suddenly being scrunched like a Coke can, when you twist it or something, versus does it turn like a human and right the parts of the body just kind of like naturally change shape. um, Capturing that in 3D software, right, where we're making all sorts of optimizations and using um, far fewer points than our skin has to articulate on, right? Our skin can bend and compress in lots of different ways. We have to make some adjustments to the way that we think about how to craft this model so that the final result will deform correctly. And one place where this is quite easily obvious is if you just look at your finger. Where's my view so I can see what I'm looking at, right? Your finger, for example, has a single cut on the inside, right? But then, so this way, maybe two cuts on the inside where it bends, right? But on the outside, right, on the top of our fingers, we have a bunch of extra skin that gets bunched up and is waiting for the finger to bend, right? So that skin can then stretch naturally over the bone. We have to mimic this in our models, right? Where on the knees of the model, on the elbows, right? Wherever there's a bend, there should be slightly more geometry on the side that's going to curve, right? And we can get away with slightly less on the side that's going to bend. I see some of you guys were experimenting with the muscle-bound model. Is that, I think it's Geralt from the bathtub scene in The Witcher, so that's pretty funny. Um, I also gave you guys this model, which I believe is a built-in Maya one. I'll double check that right now to see if he is. And when we select him, right, also notice that across his whole body, even in the tighter areas on the face, right, that all of these polygons are square, right? Even though there are certain areas where the squares turn into different shapes, like they become more diamond shaped or even more triangular, right? Um, they are still all four-sided in that they all have four edges to them. Yeah. Now the reason why we do this partly is so that we can select edge loops. So that anytime I double click on an edge, it will go as long as it possibly can, right, in a loop until it hits a point where it is not reaching a set of four quads, right? When there are four square polygons together, it can cut through the middle of them. However, once we hit five polygons, right, those edges stop the edge flow, right? And it stops us from being able to easily select things. Now, the selection has a few different reasons for it. One being animation as well, the compression of different parts of the face, the mouth being able to open and all parts of the face stretching naturally to accommodate that, the eyes also opening and closing. When we have triangles, things start to compress in strange ways, and we'll start to see that as we make mistakes along the process. It's going to be a little bit hard to demonstrate that without a broken piece. But in a lot of places, you'll get these really nice long pieces of edge flow that allow us to cut up the model more easily when we get to the UV unwrapping stage, which then helps texturing, right? And it also helps us hide seams on the model. Now, these areas that I've highlighted in red and green don't represent good and bad for red and green. They're just, I just use different colors um, to separate them out. And again, I should go to shading, wireframe on shaded, just so I can see the topology here. And I've highlighted a few different examples of where the um, detail level changes between one side and another, right? Or where things go from higher detail on one edge, right, to lower detail on the opposite side. So in this case, we have three polygons here, and that is reduced down to two polygons. And here we have four polygons reduced down to two polygons, right? This is important because we often have areas that go from a higher density of polys to a suddenly lower density of polys, right? And so in order to transition between those areas while avoiding triangles and avoiding polygons with more than four sides, right, so that we can maintain edge flow, we have to sometimes use these tricks and kind of like railroad certain strands or certain edges together, and sometimes split edges apart to give us more geometry. So another example of that is along the neck, right? The neck on our starter models is just going to be a cylinder. Maybe we can swap over to our low poly here, right? So if our neck is only four polygons, unlikely, maybe it's going to be double this. I should at least have a split down the very center of the model for symmetry reasons. So going from an area that doesn't need a lot of detail, like a neck, right, which can be a cylinder, all the way to a face with eyeballs and nostrils and a mouth and things, it becomes a challenge in knitting those two objects together or getting them um, to join up without having a bunch of extra faces, right? Because what ends up happening is, say, if I just delete this, is sometimes, and I did this one year, where I had modeled the head and I had all this great detail on the head, right? I was really proud of my sculpt, and I went and I did retopology to get the sculpt down to be lower polys, right? And I was really happy with how it looked, and he had like a good amount of detail on him, right? Here again, as you get into things like eyeballs and to the cheeks and things, you always need a lot more polygons than the rest of the model. So say something, some level of detail like this on the head in order to um, get it to be like a little bit more organic, right? Like you don't really want to get into this too early where you're pushing verts, as I call it, or manually moving things around, but let's just create a little bit more softness here just for demonstration purposes. Right, so let's say I've rounded out the head and I've got some more detail in here. Now when it comes to connecting this head to the body, I have a tougher job because now I have 1, 2, 3, 4 edges here even that need to connect to the single edge. And if I do kind of my typical bridge or just extrude, right, to make that connection, I end up with too many vertices here. And the temptation for you guys is going to be, I'm just going to target weld everything in, and I'll have an area here where it's welded, and then I'll just weld those guys in, and now that's taken care of, right? Well, now I've created all these triangles on my model, which prevents me from doing some of the selection tricks that I want to be able to do later. And this can also create problems for deforming the model when animated. So just some things that are going to feel foreign or obtuse at the moment, right? But are just kind of things to keep in the back of your head for later as we get into more advanced modeling stages and get more detail onto our character. Right, so where was I in the presentation? Let's see here. So here we have the hands as well. Hands are almost like their own character and require a lot of detail, so that's going to take some time later, right? But as I say here, any part when it's animated that's going to bend, twist, puff out, scrunch in, right, munch, it needs some sort of topology consideration, right? So our limitation is the number of bones inside the character. If you look at um, the Mixamo numbers, I believe 65 is about where they're at with a fully rigged character with hands and with feet. But that doesn't include any facial animation, right? You would probably need another 25 to 50 bones just in the face if we were going to be doing facial animation, which we don't have time to get to, unfortunately. Right, but even that is an optimized number, right? Even a higher level like 65 is still very low compared to what you might find in a Hollywood movie rig, right? A character that might have adjustment bones. Some of the things that you start to need to add are things like bones in the wrist so that the wrist can turn correctly, right? And it's not like actually rotating from the elbow when you rotate your wrist, right? Your elbow can stay completely flat and your wrist can still rotate because there are two bones here that rotate in a special way. So even 65 is an optimized number and it is relatively low. You also get bones for physics. Unity calls them spring bones, like a spring in a watch, right? Or a slinky looking spring. Now, spring bones can be used. Originally, they were used for ponytail, right? I think the first time I ever saw it was in the Tomb Raider game on the ponytail. Later, they add jiggle bones, right, to the more fleshy parts of the body. You can use your imagination there, as well as bones for things like capes, bones on anything attached to the character, say if they have like armor pieces or some like a backpack hanging off of them, right? And that needs to bounce slightly. With physics, right, you can use spring bones to add that level of realism to the physics on the character. So this is kind of just a starting point, right? 25 being your bare minimum. Typically that's going to mean your three main bones, or sometimes four along the spine here, one for the pelvis. The BIP0 is the base bone or the root bone, which starts at the bottom of the pelvis and ends at just underneath the belly button, right at the top of the pelvis. You'll have a second spine bone or BIP02 coming up through the middle of the stomach, right? And then a third spine bone through the rib cage area, right? All representing kind of solid areas of the body um, that are going to move slightly independently of the areas around it. Then you have bones along the clavicle to connect to the shoulder, single bone for the upper arm, single bone for the lower arm, five bones, right, that branch into the fingers at the start of the wrist, and then similarly for the legs, one upper thigh bone, one lower leg bone or calf bone, a single bone through the majority of the foot, and then sometimes split off into toes, although often we get away with a single toe bone that just bends all the toes um, in one motion. All right. So what I want you guys to have a look at on your character from last week, or if you have deleted them, you can use my character here, Buddy, I called him. Let me just go back in my stack to the lowest poly version of Buddy. Okay, about here. And what I wanted you to test was simply the smooth preview shortcut, which is 3 on the keyboard. Right? This is not actually smoothing our character. We can tap 1 to go back to high poly mode, right? This is just one of Maya's party tricks, where it is previewing what will happen when we click on the smooth option up here, or smooth faces. Now, smooth faces quadruples the number of polys. Notice here I have my face count at 228 at the moment. You can get this showing, and I would ask you to always have this showing for this particular class. Under display, heads up display, poly count. Now, if I were to hit the smooth button, now I'm at 912 faces, right? And what that's done is it has chopped every one of these quads down the middle and across. I have to be in object mode, or I can be in face mode and selecting, right? So now that single poly has become 4 polys, and it's also done something else, right? Which is kind of smoothed the model into a more organic shape. And if I go back and just hit 3 on the keyboard, you can see it's kind of assumed the same shape, right? So again, this is smooth preview. It's not actually increasing our poly count to 900, right? If I go back and then go to smooth preview, right? It may display this number, but this is incorrect now. Unfortunately, it does display that wrong. But we can easily get back to the low poly version, right? I'm not sure if Blender has added this feature in yet. Now, the interesting thing about that is that we can see what's going to happen if we add more geometry to our model while still maintaining this low poly phase. And what you'll start to notice that as you add edge loops, let me turn on symmetry again. If you add edge loops to a rig that has smoothing on it, the edge loops kind of reinforce, almost like a hard wire, in certain places that prevent things from scrunching down too much. So let's just look at our regular mode right now, where we can see the top of the head, right, or the head itself has almost like a coffin shape. And if I smooth it, right, it comes in quite a lot. These verts here on the edges dip in quite a bit, right? Same thing on the hands. The character actually becomes skinnier across the board, right, because of that smoothing operation. However, if I were to add more cuts to this character, additional cuts will decrease how much smoothing is occurring, or it will strengthen certain parts of the model, right? And this can be used to various effects. Let's see if, let's grab a cylinder just to demonstrate this a little bit more clearly. Polycylinder 2. And let me get rid of the subdivision caps. Now, if I were to smooth preview this, right, it's got something weird going on. What I can do to demonstrate is if I add some cuts at the top here, and then I go to smooth preview, right, notice how those cuts strengthen the top ring and keep that shape a little more barrel shaped at the top, whereas at the bottom it's going into full sphere mode. Right, so as I add cuts in certain areas, it actually strengthens the model in a sense. It's almost like building a bridge, right? If the bridge is simulated, say in a application, we might see that the bridge is like sagging in certain areas, right? Say if we turn this sideways and we pretend it's a bridge, go back to solid mode. Oh, let me use my trick holding J to snap like so. So if I were to smooth preview, right now I get like a blimp shape. Let's just go so that it's more like this, right? Might notice that things are changing shape too much. And if I want to strengthen parts of that model, right, I can add some support by adding crosscuts here. And now when I go to the preview mode, right, when this object is smoothed, the back end will stay more cylindrical, whereas the front end here has become almost pencil shaped. Now I'm not actually certain that that will be the result, so let's see what happens when we do smooth this object. There it goes. Right, we can see that it is not changing shape as much where we have more cuts. So in areas of our model that we don't want to deform as much as we move into higher poly, right, we can consider adding more cuts in order to have a nice smooth base mesh to work from. Now, base mesh is the name for the low poly model that we start with before we start to sculpt. So you might have seen, these beautiful sculpted models like our bodybuilder type character here, right? That have all of this nice anatomy across the board and like dips and the musculature is shown, right? As well as like the anatomical details on the ear and the nose and things are all captured, right? Even this can be considered a base mesh as it is. Let's see what our poly count is. It's about 10,000 polys, right? As we start to sculpt, and I do want you guys to do some sculpting today to test this out. As we start to sculpt, we need way, way more geometry than this, even 10,000 to sculpt a good character, to capture all of these nooks and crannies and bumps and lumps without it looking too Maya-like, without it looking too jagged, right? So Maya does have the ability to sculpt within the app, and it does a pretty good job actually. But in order for us to sculpt, we are going to need more geometry. This is because if I swap over to a sculpting tool here, now the problem with, or the quirk of sculpting is that the tools expect the model to be very large. So let me just show you guys where the other base meshes are located. Those are under the modeling tool set here, generate, and they are under get brush. I can then look under modeling, sculpting, base meshes, bipeds to get to humanoid ones. And here I have a few options. Oh, they've added a robot. They have a female character, an alien character, more of like a monster, more of like a cyclops troll guy. This one might be fun to start with. So if we double click on him, notice that his feet are about as wide apart as the grid, right? The original grid that we start with. Usually when we've been modeling way down here within the grid space, but for sculpting, we need our model to be much larger. So if we have this large model and we were to start sculpting, the tool sort of matches the size of the model a little bit better. You could even increase the model a bit larger, or if you double click on the tool, you get to the tool settings. I'm going to dock that here on the left, and I can change the size in these top two values, the strength being how much it is going to push and pull. Alright, as I start to sculpt a model here with 1000 polys in this case, will rapidly become quite distorted from sculpting. Let's say if I'm trying to bulk them up a little bit, I would also want symmetry to be on. Right, you can see the renderer is already twitching a little bit with the lighting and things as certain areas start to become triangulated. And if I were to, what I want you guys to do as well is to add maybe some horns to your character. Right, if I wanted to try and add some geometry up here, notice how I quickly run out of detail, that I'm already like out of polys up here to sculpt with. Now ZBrush does a much better job of filling in these areas and retopologizing itself in order to capture those details and to keep the overall size of each poly next to each other about the same, right? Rather than having some that are much larger in these areas that I've pulled. Now, if I go to poly modeling and start to smooth this character, right? I'm going to smooth him 3 times, and now I'm up at 90,000 faces. Let me smooth him one more time. Maya isn't slowing down yet, but it did take a minute for it to get there. Right now I have a lot more detail on the top of that head that I can sculpt with. So if I pop back over into my sculpting tools, turn symmetry back on, right now I can get back into it and have more polys that I can sculpt with. Right. So by default, that tool is going to go towards an average normal, or basically the average direction that all those faces are facing. So it'll be 90 degrees. Say if I'm looking at the shoulder here, right, the normal sits 90 degrees pointing away from that face. The sculpting tool is going to lift things towards that average normal, or if I hold control, they'll push things in towards the average normal. However, sometimes you want to change these, like lifting towards the camera, for example, is one way to make nicer horns. Like if I get right on the tip of the horn here, right? Sometimes I want it to go in a very specific direction, so I point the camera directly at it. So sculpting has its own quirks and tools and workflow and a way of thinking about things that is quite different to low poly modeling, and that does make it a challenge. Not everyone in this class is going to want to sculpt, and I respect that. You don't have to sculpt in order to create a good character. However, it will let you reach new heights if this is something that you want to explore as potential something that you work the potential job that you want to work as in the industry. So through many years of trial and error, right, um, the pros of the industry have gone away from low poly modeling as um, the complexity of the characters gets more intense or exceeds that which you can really tackle using low poly extrusion, cutting, Boolean techniques, right? Um, as we start to move from low poly into higher poly characters, now you can also see this in the videos that I've given you guys on our playlist. I've started a new playlist for us and I've started adding videos here. Right, and if you watch this video on how I took this very low poly model and pushed it up to being a respectable mobile level character model, right, or a very low poly character model, um, it quickly becomes more and more difficult to manage all these polys using extrusion methods, right? So instead what we do at higher levels is we go crazy, go ham with the sculpting tools, right, and get as much detail as you can possibly fit on a model. And then we use a process called retopology, which you can see, say, in this video, where we actually paint polygons back over a high poly surface and create kind of like a shell over that entire character. That allows us to have a high poly sculpt and a low poly model that fit over each other perfectly, right? Even though one might have millions of polygons and one might only have thousands. What we then do with that shell is we fire virtual photons basically through both models and we measure the distance between the two. And then we use textures to offset the low poly model polygons so that they look closer in position to the high poly ones, right? So even though we might have a flat area on the low poly side, because we have the high poly, say, underneath or on top of it, um, the shader is able to lift certain areas of that low poly up and down in order to create new effects, right? Much like we've done with normals and bump maps in the past. So we will be baking our own normal maps from a high poly character down to a low poly. And this allows us to keep the optimized and bendable, animatable properties of the low poly while still capturing all the nice details on a high poly model. Right, so I do want you guys to test out the smooth mesh a little bit and the preview smoothing with 1 and 3 on your low poly guy. Try adding some more detail, right? Try smoothing them out, see how it works. Now we've already covered what happens in this file, so I do want you guys to test that out in here. You can use this character as a base mesh just to experiment with, but not for your final. I still want you guys to make your own base mesh for the final. And here I have some basic overviews of the sculpting tool. Just remember, it's better to just scale your character way up when you need to be sculpting, and to smooth the character several times in order to have enough detail on the surface that you can move things around. So with all that said, right, on the technical Maya side, we're still thinking mainly about story and character in this class. Without an interesting story, without an interesting character for us to connect to, your cinematic is going to be forgettable, right? You're going to put tens of hours, maybe 100 hours into this thing if you're really ambitious. You don't want all that time to go to waste just because you didn't really figure out what you wanted to say in your story, or that the interaction that you have maybe between a character and the environment, or two characters, just didn't mean anything to the viewer, that it was just a bit boring. So for this week, I want you to produce a final-ish version of your character art from the front, wearing whatever they're going to be wearing, right? With with whatever style they're going to be in. If they're going to be more anime style, more futuristic style, right? More just modern, more cutesy or low poly style, all that should be captured in the concept art. Now, typically, and what I have up on the lecture series, I believe for this week or next week, is some tips on how to get started on character art from a mood board, and using reference to create the front view, in my case, from, I guess this video is about creating the front view from a piece of concept art, rather. Where's our week 4 lab? Back to that. Playlists, 2023. So this kind of goes into what we were looking at last week with silhouette shapes, right, for your character, where we should be able to tell something about the character just from the overall silhouette. Okay, so this video, if you look at the end of this video, I go into a little bit more sketching and doodling until I started to find some shapes and some sort of character vibe that that I wanted to go with. However, in our case, we now have these wonderful AI art tools, and let me show you how that works. So I am using a tool called Stable Diffusion, and what this allows me to do is run an AI on my computer and use my graphics card in order um, to do all the calculations necessary for that, to produce final images. Now, this particular guide has got a bit of an offensive name, but here is the URL: rentry.org/voldy. It is the Voldy guide. Let's just leave out the middle part. And I suggest you follow this guide to get your setup up to just this first point, step 7. Once you complete step 7, then you can swap over to another website, Civit AI, CIVIT.AI.com, in order to get one of these nice models or simulation models. Now, the one I'm using is called Eldred's Lucid Mix, but there are some that are more anime themed. And I'm also trying to use this character turner for next week. I'm gonna have to do some more experimentation on it though. So notice all these blurred out ones. Rather don't download too much of that stuff, guys, please. This is like downloading an artist onto your computer, right? So these artists are going to be able to draw in different styles. So pick something that's appealing to you. But again, like I mentioned in class, safe for work, SFW, is going to be one of our key terms here. Please don't spice up your model too much, right? It can have some sex appeal, but it shouldn't be a total babe, right? That's not the point. Now, I just came up with some terms to test this out the other night, and it like already blew me away, like how fast and how cool these results were. So like this was my first video game boss monster that it generated, and like it just made so many cool ones. I just wanted to make all of them, um, because they look so evil and monstrous and dangerous and things. So my first tests were of boss monsters. I was trying to get like the box art of like the hero facing the monster, right? But my terms did not quite bring that through. It really just focused and see. Some of them have the hero in the foreground. Most of them just had this huge mega boss monster. Um, and man, they are cool. So AI art for the win. I think if you're a 3D artist, if you're a concept artist, sad face, you know, pour one out. F to pay respects. We couldn't have gotten this far without them, but now uh, it's like we're all going to be just firing out of a cannon now because the level of quality is going to go up for everybody, right? Because everyone else is going to be using these things. If you want to take the high road and not use a tool like this, you're really making your life more difficult than it needs to be, right? So now I started to look at more heroic characters, right? Main character vibes a little bit. They're still in this dark fantasy land, but this is because of this particular model that I was using. Now, in these ones, I was using Eldreth's something stolen mix or something like that. When I load up, right, I get this text to image, and this is where the image prompt goes. If you want to use Midjourney, you can do that through Discord, and you just need to join their server. I think I linked it up in chat somewhere. Now, Midjourney, you're able to generate images 4 at a time using just a line of text in their prompt. You then choose to either upscale or produce varieties of that particular image, right? But this is a nice way to get some clever search terms that you might not think of adding to your text prompt, right? So I can do all sorts of cool stuff, 8 bits, and Midjourney is like even more powerful than the Stable Diffusion ones in my experience. It just really produces these photorealistic, gorgeous images, right? So no excuse for not having concept art next week, because you're able to generate it in a few seconds, really. So these are some hero character concepts. Now these are generated at a low res, right? More like thumbnail size. So they don't have a lot of detail on their faces in some cases, and they might have some other problems with them. You really want to just start with a vibe, right? Like something that's like, wow, that nailed like 3/4 of the process for me, right? Like maybe there are a few things on there that you don't quite like or that don't quite mesh well with your idea. This was when I was thinking of doing like cyberpunk style witches, maybe might be a fun one to model. And then I tried out some monster characters, right? Some tentacle monsters, and then I did some lobster type monsters. Um, and finally, I stumbled on some mushroom monsters because I'm watching Last of Us. And like this guy, oh my gosh. So so cool. Like I wanna meet this NPC in a video game, right? Like he looks like he's got some stories. So even if you're not doing a traditional Nathan Drake, type of video game hero, right? You don't have to go that direction. You can create something really cool and surreal and interesting, right? Because we're not limited by the physical realm, right? We are in 3D, so we are able to make all sorts of cool ideas come to life. Just keep in mind that we do want to use Mixamo, so in that sense, we're limited to biped characters, right? We don't want to have characters on all fours. We don't necessarily even want to have lobster characters with all sorts of extra arms, or heaven forbid tentacles. Tentacles are a nightmare, but they're fun to look at in concept art. So go forth, experiment inside of Midjourney, inside of Stable Diffusion if you want to run it at home. I won't go as far to say this is dangerous to your computer, but it is a render operation and it will um, accelerate your graphics card up to 100% usage, right? Just like playing a video game, maybe even slightly more. I find that it heats up my graphics card quite quickly, so not super recommending doing this on a laptop. Um, right now we have a few machines at school with this installed. You can ask Eoin which ones they are. I believe they are at the back near the board games. Now, other things to keep in mind in here is this little sampling method section is where all of your controls are for the detail levels, for the output size, um, and in this case, CFG scale, which I've found is kind of like a checker. It kind of checks itself to see that you don't have extra arms or extra fingers and things like that, right? So sometimes what I usually start with is like quite a low resolution, right? Just to generate thumbnails. Leaving the seed at -1 will mean a random seed for each one. You then have the batch count here, which is how many images it's going to produce. The top number, batch count, is going to draw, say, 4 images, and let's just see what this does here, just to remind myself. But the difference between batch and batch count and size. Now, when I hit generate, it is actually doing most of the work here in a command prompt. This is just the way that I connect to the local server on my machine. Nobody else can see this online or anything like that. Alright, so here we have some fantastic looking Godzilla type monsters that I can click through. Oh man, he looks really hungry. Really nice examples already. Now if we look at these thumbnails, right, what the batch count has done is it has increased the seed value by 1 for each different monster. Now, if I wanted to, say, say I really fell in love with one of these, let's say Mr. Hungry Face here, what I can do is I can copy this seed, paste it back into the program, and instead of counting up from that seed, I can make several variations of that seed through the batch size. Oops. Also, mouse wheel up and down while you have one selected will change the value there. The other things I can do are obviously increase the resolution if I stumble upon one that I really like, right? I can start to add more detail to it. I also want to start bumping up the sampling steps, which is going to get more detail onto the surface of the character and go more into the pixel by pixel sort of range in order to find that detail. So there's a really nice, where is that guide? A nice visual overview of how these things come about. Sampling versus steps, right? So the more steps we have, like the less blurry it becomes and the more sharp the image becomes. You could think of it like this. The sampling method also changes how or what image it starts from. Notice that all of these images really just start from noise, right? Which is just like a garbled mess of nothingness. And then it tries to look at that image and change a few pixels each time to get closer and closer to its final form, right? To its most detailed form. So we don't need a ton of steps to get something interesting, but the more steps that you add, the more sort of details it's going to catch. Now the other thing you can do is kind of reinforce some of the things that you like about this creature or this sketch by adding to the text prompt as you increase these values, right? I kind of think of it like almost like growing a fungus on a little plate, right? Like the fungus is going to sort of grow wider and wider, and you can kind of direct it in a certain direction in order for that neural network to reach a certain goal, right? So now we have video game boss monster, backlit box art, blah, 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 blah. If I like this kind of dragon scales and stuff, like green and reds, right, I can start to include or exclude certain things. Say maybe I don't want it to have spikes on them, so I could put that um, into the negative prompt, and that might help eliminate some of that. But I do really like his teeth. So I can say monster with big teeth, open mouth, right? I hit generate. It's going to create 4 using this one seed. So the layout of the image or the structure, the pose that the character is in should stay about the same between those 4 images because I'm using the same seed. I only bumped up my sampling step slightly, so it might not have a drastic effect on the overall look of it. And I didn't really mess with my CFG scale, so I'm still going to get some weirdness on the fingers and toes and things where the anatomy might have some wishy-washy or some kind of deformed sort of areas, right? So as you start to add and subtract from these prompts, right, you can start to also add things into the negative, like bad anatomy, extra fingers, right, too many eyeballs, whatever it's going to be. You can start to, again, like steer the direction that that neural network is searching for an answer. So even with my powerful GPU, it still takes a minute. So just let it do its thing. It should give us a percentage up here. I'm not sure why that's not displaying at the moment. Maybe it's at the bottom. So it is slowing down my PC a little bit. You can get away with doing other things, but maybe not super graphics intensive things. So this is one of the downsides of rendering, is that you have to wait. And it's because I increased my resolution up to 512 probably that this is taking its time a little bit. I'll pause it. Alright, so I had a little hiccup there, and it wasn't quite so happy with me. So here I've gotten, oh my gosh, some really creepy, more creepy monsters. It's really, these more surreal models tend to do um, more exaggerated proportions and things. But again, what I might want to do is just keep my my resolution down while I'm still experimenting, right? So if none of them really grab my attention, right, then we either go back to the drawing board and go back to a -1 seed, and then rather increase the batch count, right, to create a new bunch of options that or that kind of dials us back and like, okay, let's take a step back and go in a new direction, right? Again, if the anatomy and stuff is bothering me, I can also go back and increase the CFG scale. I don't want to call it config, but it might be config scale. So now when I generate, okay, so before, I don't know what I did wrong, but it wasn't showing me my progress bar. Right, but you're not always going to get what you want. You do have to kind of massage your prompt terms in order to get something interesting. And other times, right, you might just feel like the model itself, the artist, is not cut out for the style that you're going for, right? These are giving me very dragon-like ones. Oof, that's a pretty scary one. So maybe using spikes down here was my problem. He's also got lots of mouthy ones. But yeah, adding to the prompt, let's see if we do like a monster wolf, right? If we're getting too many dragon type of ones, then we're like, all right, uh, let's go in the other direction by by just giving it something completely different to focus its attention on and generate some new options there. Um, so similarly to story design, right? You might want to set this up as a boss final encounter type of scene. That could mean that you're making two models, two characters, rather than one, which isn't really the situation that you want to be in. Rather, you want to try think of something where your character can be interacting with an environment or um, or some sort of foible that prevents them from doing something that they want. Um, so let me pull up an example of that. So for example, it always makes me think of this One Punch Man scene where the world's strongest hero, this guy's basically Superman, uh, encounters a mosquito and he is trying to kill this mosquito, right? But it keeps getting away no matter like how much he thinks that he's just like nailed it. So for your character, right? Maybe they have a certain character flaw or you use their strengths against them to create some sort of situation that they're now struggling to overcome, even though it might be something as simple as trying to kill a fly or a mosquito, right? Um, so you don't have to go all out in a character versus character conflict, right? It could be character versus themselves, character versus environment, character versus the supernatural. Those kinds of options also exist, right? So look at some Pixar shorts are a good way to get ideas for those. Cartoons, right? Looney Tunes, the old school stuff. Great way to get ideas. Don't worry about stealing, right? Steal ideas from other stuff that you already like. Um, your goal is to find something that the viewer can latch on to and remember your work by. Um, so once we change the theme, right? If we changed it from One Punch Man fighting a mosquito to Wolfman fighting a flea that's on his back, right? Oh, Wolfman is actually, maybe we can do change to werewolf. Um, Maybe that already totally changes the look of it, right, the feel of it, to the point that nobody's gonna be like, oh, you just copied that scene from One Punch Man, right? Like, no, it won't even occur to somebody because the idea becomes generic, right? It is no longer original, because you've added originality on top of it in the execution stage. So for this week, browse the net, come up with some mood boards, come up with some story ideas, right? And then give us a taste of what your character is going to look like by posting a character design in the chat that you plan to use. Since we have the strike, we can't move ahead on some things because we also want to get in touch with the sound students in order to produce sound effects for us. We also have to kind of give them a taster, or like, you know, an earthworm on a hook, so that we can reel them in and make sure that they want to work on our projects, because we get to work on cool stuff here. So I'm sure they will be interested in working on your projects. It shouldn't be a big deal, but you do want to like hype them up, right, and show them how cool the stuff is that we get to work on in games. And also think of it as a portfolio piece, right? If you want to tie this into your AGP, that's another option. You could create a trailer for your AGP. You could be creating the main character model for your AGP so that you don't have to make one next year, right? Or just make a boss or a monster character for your AGP, and then once you've gone through this process once, it's going to be a bit easier to make a nicer character next year, right? So generally, each time that we go through this process of making a character, you learn so much about that, um, the technical process, that the next one that you create is going to be twice as good. Um, so use this, right, towards other projects if you wish. Our project is going to be create a story cinematic, 15 to 30 seconds, just like story design. You can take it a little bit longer if you want. If you want to have narration, if you want to make your own music, you want to make sound effects or particle effects, if you want to 3D scan something, right? All of that can be done. It all just has to live inside of Unity. So our goal is going to be to grab Maya by the horns, get it to make what we want it to make, texture it all in Substance Painter, and then have a really good looking final product that we'll render inside of Unity HDRP. And that's what we got to look forward to. So this week you should be digging around on the net, looking for inspiration, looking for images for your mood board, right? Coming up with reference, sketching characters if you so desire. Otherwise, jumping headfirst into this AI image generation stuff, right? Let's just do a hero character just so we can show hero main character maybe. Um, and if it's just an image that inspires you, right? Often that's how things work. Start to build a story around that. You can always go from the high level and go back down and figure out the small details later. Or if you start with something small, you can always expand the lore out just like we did in story design, right? Figure out the rules of the world. Where is it that these people live? What are the rules of that game world? Is it near future? Is it post-apocalyptic, right? Use one of these video game tropes for your portfolio. Sci-fi space marines, knights and castles, fantasy world, modern world as we see it around us now, stylized hopefully like the Sims kind of style, right? Uh, slash like Fortnite if you go more Fortnite style. As you leave those genres, right, you become more niche, and it decreases the amount of companies that are going to want to look at your portfolio or be interested in your work. So try not to go full horror or any of those sorts of more niche categories, right? You can go more cutesy. Cutesy is still a good bet, right? don't push it full anime, right? Don't go, no, nobody goes full anime and gets a job in the Western Hemisphere at least, right? It means that your competition is very different, and it's harder for you to compete in those markets, the Eastern markets. So you can have some anime influence, absolutely. You can have anime-like characters. I would just prefer that you steer away from full anime because some people that are going to be grading your work, Andy, are not anime fans, and they will. Well, they're anime fans, but they don't like seeing uh, our students in London working on anime stuff, right? Leave that to the professionals. They're reaching much higher levels there, right? And they're trained for that. We are trying to train towards Western audiences and Western studios. So typically, those are our tropes or our themes or our genres, right? That we live within. Fantasy, sci-fi, modern, they're the main ones. Try to gear your portfolio towards that. That was some advice given to me by a very high-level artist friend of mine who went to work for Blizzard and then for Riot and is now working for the Slime Rancher team. Um, you want to make it a little bit more generic so that it's approachable, right? Because it's not only artists who are going to be looking at this, it'll be managers and human resource people and things like that. So if you have, a portfolio that is all stabby and bloody and dark and violent, right? Some people are gonna like just toss your application out right away, right? You don't want that to happen. You want to get it through the gates so that the people who know what they're looking at can appreciate it. So go forth, have fun with these AI models, right? Experiment a little bit in there. Again, rentree.org/Voldy, Civet AI for uh, the artists themselves or the models themselves to get some idea of what their capabilities are. You can click on some of these, and they also have like recent Instagram posts, right, and things that people have made with that particular model. That some of them also are kind enough to give you some ideas for settings and additional prompts to, excuse me, additional pieces of text to add to your prompts. So hopefully this is helpful, guys. I know I went a bit long in this video, but this stuff is new and it needs a little bit of explaining and experimentation. So don't be afraid to, get your hands dirty a little bit and try and wring out these tools for all they're worth. Because right now there are thousands and thousands of other artists out there that are experimenting with this stuff and pushing the limits and combining things in interesting ways, right? You're competing against all of them. We're running a race here, and the more hours you put in, right, the higher your chances of finding gold and finding a company that's going to want to hire you. So as usual, I'll be around on Discord all week and all weekend if you want me to take a look at your stuff. Homework is going to be to come up with that character art for your main character and start to think about your story. Next week we will work on storyboards a little bit more. So hopefully doing a bit of the character posing this week gave you some ideas of what's possible, right? As far as evoking emotions through physical um, poses, right? Just keep that up as we are going to be forgoing passing by facial animation, right? We won't have facial animation for this particular one. So helmets are good, masks are good, um, and I'll get you guys all through the technical side of things. Don't worry about that. Maya is just gonna be hammer on nail. You decide if you're the hammer or you're the nail, right? Depending on how much time you put into this stuff, it swaps, right? Um, but I will do my best to make the process easy and fun. So first step is to start to fall in love with a character that you can see yourself spending the next 12 weeks with. You don't want to choose something that you get stuck with and you decide that you hate them 2 weeks in, right? And have to scrap your project. So um, have fun this weekend, guys. And sorry about this strike stuff, but we'll get through it. And I will talk to you online soon.